you all for joining us. Great to have you here. And we're going to be really looking at critical mineral outlooks. Now, Joe, you have some very, very interesting reports, and that I believe anybody can actually see as well. But, you know, when I was looking at some of the figures here, World Bank actually saying when we look at the production of minerals that the demand is, you have some numbers on this, it's growing huge. You know, a lot really needed to look and meet global targets. So from the IF, what's your outlook? What are you looking at?
Well, thanks, and it's great to be here. I noticed we lost half the crowd who want to meet Fareed, so we'll try to keep their attention. For those of you who might not know, the IEF is the International Energy Forum. We're actually based here in Riyadh in the diplomatic quarter across the street. We have 72 member countries who are members of the IEF, so we're government energy ministries, mining ministries who are members. We traditionally focus on oil and gas and sort of the transition more generally, but I think as we've heard at the conference in the opening session and indeed at the ministerial meeting for those who were there, is that now mining and critical minerals is becoming is urgently needed to be considered with all these energy security and energy transition and meeting climate goals. So there's certainly a need for producer-consumer dialogue on critical minerals, but also between the energy and mining communities as well, because these issues are now increasingly intertwined, and so this is something we're doing. Last year we, with the Payne Institute and the Colorado School of Mines, produced a report that essentially looks at the various outlooks for critical minerals, both supply and demand, the publicly available ones at least, out to 2030, 2040 to meet the energy transition. The oil and gas sector has very, I think, more mature outlooks because we've been at it, I think, a longer time. But even within those mature outlooks in oil and gas, the difference between the lowest demand for oil and gas in 2050 and the highest demand in 2050 is about 100 million barrels a day, which is about the size of today's oil market. So if you're a company needs to make an investment decision, or you're a government policymaker needing to make roadmap decisions, that's a lot of indecision there in the various outlooks. Similarly is the case in critical mineral outlooks. And again, the outlooks are not as mature yet as in the oil and gas sector. So this is something that we're focusing on because we do it on the oil and gas side, and we'll continue to be working with the Payne Institute, I think, on this project.
And again, I mean, those outlooks on the oil and gas side are so valuable, and really they've grown. We'll talk a little bit more in terms of that producer-consumer focus, but they're so important now. And it makes great sense, I think, to just move these on to critical minerals. Paul, when we look at critical minerals and we look at mining and minerals and metals and that, come back to me and I suppose give me a little bit of what do you classify as critical minerals, and again, how does it differ in various parts of the world? What do we really need?
Yeah, look, I think, I mean, we generally think of what do we need for the energy transition and what does that look like. I think there's often a lot of confusion between critical materials, so what's made when we actually go through some additional processing, and what's a critical mineral. I think the things that policymakers need to remember is minerals is what we're going to run out of first. We actually need to focus for the initial part of the energy transition, certainly, on minerals and what we're going to miss out on and what's going to be short. Those shortages are then obviously exacerbated by geopolitical issues and supply chain issues, and so you do get differences between countries, but I think largely they get down to what's available and what's been put in place that we're able to extract. I think one of the ones that I think gets left out far too much is iron ore and metallurgical coal.
Okay.
I think we have a
basic but essential and critical, huh?
If you think about how we're going to make sure the energy transition happens, the first bit we need is the infrastructure. we need to generate power before we transmit it and before we store it. And iron ore, I think, will be okay on. I mean, the Pilbara will continue to produce. We're pretty hopeful that Simandou will get up and running, and there'll be some diversity in terms of what's there. Vale's obviously got their act together and is working well. But metallurgical coal's under real risk. Most people, the public doesn't understand what it is. Capital markets don't understand what it is. They don't realise the difference. Hydrogen's not ready to produce steel yet in terms of what's there. And so I have this real concern that the mineral will run out of, and that will really hamper the energy transition, is metallurgical coal. As bad as that sounds to use the word coal when you talk about energy transition, it is going to be an issue as we move on.
Oh, okay, interesting. Because again, it's not what we hear discussed. And Ian, let's have a look at that from the U.S. perspective. Because again, different things in different countries. But what's the critical dilemma about what minerals are top of the list in terms of what's needed in the U.S.?
Right, and so the definition of critical becomes critical because if you have so many that are critical, then it's hard to say, well, you got every mineral called critical. They're all critical, right? Iron ore, coal, things like that. In the United States, the big talking point is copper. So the definition of criticality that's generally used is you have a very succinct supply from one country or two countries. And for copper, that's it's fairly ubiquitous, or it's fairly, produced in lots of places, so it never makes the criticality list, but the politicians really like to complain that it doesn't, because as Paul mentioned, almost everything is critical for where we would like to go. So it ends up being political football. It ends up being almost uninteresting, unuseful with his definitions of critical, given how wide it is and given kind of the political nature of some of these things.
Do you think we get carried away a bit maybe by looking at the rare earth and going down that avenue, and actually it is about coming back to basics, because without that we really can't progress?
Yeah, again, if it's critical, it means we need it in order to move forward. Yeah.
Yeah. So get our definition right before anything else. Don't be getting too excited. How about we need the other stuff.
Right.
Joe, talk to me about this producer-consumer dialogue in the critical mineral space and how important, because I sometimes get the feeling that really hasn't been happening as much as it has in hydrocarbons.
Right. So just like in the oil and gas sector, you have certain producers and certain consumers, and the same is true in the mining and in the critical minerals sector alone. And so it's important because a lot of the large consuming countries are also a lot of the large consuming countries, maybe the exception of China, on the oil and gas side. So it's just really important, especially as we talk later about geopolitics, that we have, I think, a producer-consumer dialogue to maybe avoid putting more challenges in the way, like trade restrictions and things like that later down the road. So I just think it's really important. But as you're talking about the definition of critical minerals, it occurs to me that I want to maybe introduce a new term for this conference and in this sector, and that's the question of whether we've hit peak critical minerals. In the oil and gas sector,
we're going to go into peak demand and peak
No, in the oil and gas side,
yeah.
This term peak oil was introduced several years ago. Of course, that disappeared with the shale revolution in the United States. But the reserves were found, but it was actually produced. I think in the minerals area, we certainly know that the minerals exist, and we think in the quantities that we need. The problem is the production, the mining, and the processing facilities. And we just have to speed up investment in this sector. We have to speed up the permitting parts of it. That's going to help. That's what's really needed to avoid this idea of peak minerals. And you mentioned the World Bank number. Some of the figures we had in our report with the Payne Institute is that the energy transition median demand projections, lithium in 2040 is 702 kilotons, or 13 times Australia's current annual production. And Australia is the biggest producer of lithium right now. Copper, which is the metal of electrification, which I think was mentioned earlier, we need the equivalent of 2 Chiles. Congo, we need the equivalent of 2.5 Congos to meet these energy transition demand needs. So these challenges are enormous, and as someone who attends a lot of energy conferences, not as many mining conferences, so I think that has to change, and a lot of energy transition conferences, including the recently held COP meeting. I think the challenge that's presented by the demand needs of critical minerals gets glossed over.
Yes.
And I don't think it's really understood as well as it needs to be. So that's why this conference is very important. Yeah. And I was saying to some colleagues today, maybe we need to have the FMF side by side with the next COP meeting so that people understand the needs of the mining sector and the benefits of the mining sector to the energy transition.
Oh, I think you're so right, and also how energy intensive it is. So therefore, to actually get that transition moving, we do have to have a little bit of a lag time, so to speak. Ian, when we look at demand, whether it be, in terms of supply, what we've got at the moment, we need more, clearly. So how important are new areas like what's happening here in Saudi Arabia, when we look at the potential that's here, and even those figures we heard, I think just yesterday, that, the resources were valued about 1.3 trillion. They've been upgraded to 2.5 trillion worth of resources, and that's with only 30% of the country that's been explored. So there's so much to go here. And I suppose other countries, like what's happening in Indonesia, there's a big rush there. How important are these new sources of minerals?
Oh, they're critical. And I would say after events like the forum, and the Payne Institute also has a connection with CAPSARC, which is a little closer to the airport.
Yeah.
On your way out of town, you'll pass by their nice building. But, there's a lot going on here. It's very exciting. It's going to really relieve a lot of pressure on development that would otherwise have to happen in places that may not really want it to be happening, right? Well, people have mentioned many times, I'm sure we'll get into it, permitting has been a big issue. But as people have said here, when the leadership gets involved, things start to happen, which isn't always happening in other places.
And I was actually talking to one of the deputy ministers too, who actually, just when they're looking at an awful lot of the resources here, he literally said they are in the middle of nowhere. So yes, they have stakeholders that they need to look after and that, but there are so many areas where, we're really looking at just vast desert land. So that actually helps them as well. Paul, let's talk a little bit about the permitting and the delays in permitting, and I suppose the challenges that this brings up. Without a doubt, the supply is needed. The green, no oil, people would probably like to see a lot more of electrification, and therefore we need a lot more minerals. But how do we actually get over the fact that there are hurdles, when it comes to permitting, and also, I suppose, threatening good projects and threatening supply as well, ultimately?
Yeah, look, absolutely. I think if you sit back and look at the industry and look at how we're going to get minerals to market and what we're going to do in terms of that, the brand of the industry is one of the major inhibitors of that, and something that we still have to work on significantly. And I think, as an industry, we need to work on that, and then we need to be in a stronger position to be able to lobby people to fix things like permitting, like the time that it takes to get a mine up.
What is the worst case scenario at the moment? Or what's the best?
The best is, it's interesting to say what's the best. The worst is, if you sort of look at Canada and Australia at the moment, to get a new resource developed is 10 to 12 years. Wow. In terms of what's there. And so if you think, we've got...
you do need a lot of patience.
We've all signed up to targets for 2050. Unfortunately, if you measure best just on timeline, you end up with a bunch of other issues. So you end up with other ESG issues arising, other community issues arising, other brand issues arising. And I think, mining companies and others have to think about permitting as part of that portfolio of issues that they manage around all of ESG and around the way that they dominate. And I think, we've seen those functions move far closer to the CEO, far closer to the centre in terms of what the business is, and I think that's been a really positive move in terms of what's there. So that hopefully this rush to generate critical minerals won't create the issues that we've seen in the past. You know, I've been to a couple of the new mines in some of the new regions. I won't name countries, but you know, some of the ones that have been mentioned today, you compare a mining operation there from a health and safety perspective, from an environmental output perspective, from a supply chain perspective, and there are things that really concern me as a person that's passionate and interested in the mining industry. So you can imagine what your millennial sitting in Europe that's going to be your end consumer of this would think about it if they knew, actually, if our battery is going to come from nickel that comes from that place and is produced in that way, I don't want it. And I think we've got to keep that in mind when we think about how much we want to accelerate these processes. We want to accelerate the time frame, but we don't want to lose some of the good practices that have been built in there.
Yeah, if I could just jump in here. I mean, I think your point is very well taken. We in certain areas we have to do a lot better, and I take your point about concerning even you. But this idea that it takes 10 years to permit a mine.
Yeah.
I mean, what we need is, let's go back to the oil and gas example. You know, Germany, gas supplies are cut off from Russia. Yeah. Germany is desperate to get LNG from the U.S., but they don't have import terminals. So what did they do? They basically expedited the permitting for these import terminals. It took 10 years to get the permitting and the public comment and everything for an import terminal. Germany just did it in 1 year. Yep. And I don't think anybody's thought that they cut corners in Germany, but we need to do the same thing, I think, in mining. I mean, if we're serious about expediting the energy transition, we need the same urgency about producing and investing to be able to expand mining capacity of critical minerals.
Absolutely.
Ian, you know, when it comes to investment, I mean, where is the I suppose the good money? Where's the interested money in the energy sector? And maybe you want to touch on this, Paul, as well. But you know, are we in danger of losing investment because it's coming with such great green credentials? And how important is it that investment is kept there?
Yeah, I mean, I think obviously, as mentioned already, Canada, Australia are two high-quality places to invest in new mining infrastructure, and it doesn't, from where I sit, at least in the U.S., I know there are some Canadians or Australians that complain it takes too long, and I always say the grass is greener on the other side, right? Check out what happens over here. Those seem like places where there is really strong investment, there's really, or where there's a lot happening, a lot being moved forward. I will say the part on the investment side that always really interests me is, obviously most of these critical minerals were minor metals. They're produced with something else. At the refining or processing stage, you need to pull them apart. So many places can do that. We have those assets available, but we're going to flood the market with this critical mineral as soon as we expand, some production technique. And so the thing you're trying to sell is all of a sudden going to crash in price. How do you get investment when you're about to crash a market? I think that's a good policy question to end on.
And looking at investment, even at the moment, Paul, we're looking at the price of copper. Maybe Joe, you'll come in on this too, because investment has to be attractive,
Yep.
And so further investment in this right now, and even with lithium as well, we've sort of stalled a little bit, have we?
Oh, look, absolutely. I think, the previous presentation was really good in terms of talking about patient capital.
Yes, I like that term.
Absolutely. I think, traditional capital markets have become quite left-wing when we sort of look at them. They're now dominated by pension funds. The way that they think about capital is quite different. But the way that capital is applied is still based on quarterly returns, and you've got to drive these measures that are just unrealistic for a mining project. And so I think we've seen more and more alternative sources of capital that have started to come into the market. Private equity has been one example, but sovereign capital is another. And whether that's sovereign capital in the way someone like PIF's able to do it, or it's incentive schemes like the IRA and pieces like that. I think of those things as a capital mechanism these days, rather than some alternative form of founding. And the one issue we've got with a lot of those government type incentive schemes is they're focused on the wrong part of the value chain. They're very much focused on materials and not on minerals. And so one of the things I constantly say to governments is you've got to get the minerals before you can produce materials. Never forget that.
Joe, I mean, again, we look at the hydrocarbon sector that's, you know, desperately still needing investment just to keep sort of on par with what we need, you know, to carry on and to get the energy transition underway. But is there a danger in terms of investment that there's not enough right now?
Yeah, look, I take the point that pricing will encourage investment, especially in key minerals. But at the same time, again, I just came back from the COP meeting in Dubai, and we're talking about accelerating. The key word is accelerating the transition. So I'm worried that we're going to be in a situation where demand is outstripping supply and raising the cost of electrification, and actually end up slowing the energy transition. And so, look, this is something that governments, certainly the private sector, but governments have to take seriously and figure out ways to incentivize investment in the sector again, and in the roles that we talked about in terms of permitting and regulation, because that has an impact as well on investment.
Did you want to come back on that? I mean,
No, I fully agree with that.
Yeah.
I think that capital is not going to go to a project that's going to take 12 years to approve. I mean, take Resolution Copper. 30 years to approve. I mean, capital is going to go where it knows it can get a return, and the people within the business can build a model, and they can have some certainty around it, and they can understand that they don't always have to take returns that hit a benchmark, but they have to have some predictability in terms of what they're doing. And these delays in permitting, these uncertainties around geopolitics, they really impact that ability to get certainty. And I think, mining companies will accept a lower return. They've started to invest in renewable energy projects, they've started to invest in reforestation. Those aren't 15% return projects,
Yes.
they're 5% return projects. So mining companies will do it if there's certainty. And so I think that's a big part of what we've got to encourage.
and of course, in this sector, Ian, if I can come to you, certainty is it's definitely not promised. A lot of the resources are in countries around the world that have some major geopolitical issues. And again, I think this is one of the areas that investors are going to be looking at. I mean, investors are they're not risk averse. They definitely want to look, and they've learned in the past sort of big risk is big reward sometimes.
Right.
But how carefully do we really have to look at the geopolitics? And where are we within this? I mean, some countries are managing fine, others not. So, what to do?
Yeah, I mean, it is certainly something you can't ignore. I mean, I will say most of the mining companies, it's not the first time they've ever had to go into politically difficult places, so they have ways to deal with that. Similarly, with prices going up and down, I mean, there's the super cycles were invented for mineral commodities. We kind of understand how to deal with the ups and downs of those kind of things. And one question I might have for Paul or other folk is, why aren't more hedging techniques in use when these prices come up and down? But, the mineral geopolitics are going to play out. We're going to have scenarios where, I guess more recently, right, the US allowed UK and Australia to be part of the Defense Production Act as a way to strengthen investment in those places. And so there'll always be the friend-shoring friendly places I think that people will want to be at, and then they'll move on to the less and less friendly places.
Paul, I mean, again, let's have a look at the geopolitics and the damage that it can actually sometimes, cause even within country and nationalization of resources. That's still a real risk out there in some areas.
Sure, absolutely it's a risk, and you shouldn't downplay that. I think, though, sometimes we get overly concerned about what some of the regulations are, and they do get overplayed. So, I mean, there's been a lot of criticism about the new system that's in place in Chile. But in reality, the system in Chile, it caps royalties and tax at 48%. Every miner in Canada and Australia would love to be paying 48%.
Right.
And it says you've got to use a local development partner to access our resources. It doesn't limit what you can do.
Yeah.
I think it's fine. So the worst example of geopolitics has been the state of Queensland in Australia that's going to absolutely destroy metallurgical coal, and when we find it there, because it will exist because of all the bauxite, all the rare earths that are there are going to suffer the same thing. So I think, yes, it's a huge issue, but I think don't get carried away that things are really bad and stop you being able to produce. Good producers can cope with a tax rate of 48% and a local partner. I don't think that should put anyone off.
Joe, again, in all of your Outlook reports, this is something you'll look at seriously. Where do you think are the key issues and the risks when it comes to geopolitics?
Well, again, as I said earlier, I think that the trend now in geopolitical risk in this space is on trade barriers and
Yes.
and export restrictions. And again, this is why we need more producer-consumer dialogue to really talk about these issues. It's already a very challenging space, as we've talked about here and in other sessions, to add other obstacles or challenges. It just makes, accomplishing the energy transition goals more difficult. The OECD recently came out with a report that said export restrictions on critical minerals increased fivefold over the last 10 years. So it's a serious problem. We have to address it. And again, I go to a lot of conferences and ministerial meetings, and I have to say this does not really get discussed.
And again, so something that I think some people sort of shy away from it sometimes. And, even I had a panel today with a Chinese producer on, and I was not going to be able to draw him in on the anything vaguely political about China and about energy security in China, so that we have a resistance in terms of not wanting to talk about it. But when we look at supply, Ian, if we can just look, is there any other way to meet supply? Are there alternatives out there? Is the demand is so big right now. There would be some people that say we should not be, looking for resources. We should not be exploiting mining resources, that there must be the vegan option, so to speak.
Well, as, I guess card-carrying academic economist, right? The necessity is the mother of invention. My favorite story from my time at the Critical Materials Institute at School of Mines is that when the rare earth prices went up in 2011, all of the motor manufacturers were like, well, right now our motors are 7%, 6% rare earths. But actually, we looked into it, and we could probably get by with 0.5% rare earths, and it still work. And of course, they had no reason to think about that when they were cheap and everywhere. And so I kind of believe that, yes, we will need minerals, but where there are pinch points, people will try to make a better mousetrap, whether this be moving from the NMCA batteries to sodium batteries, or just some other, taking one mineral out that's more dear and putting in one that's more plentiful.
But it still comes down to mineral mining metals. That's what we still really need.
Obviously, we can't get rid of them all. They play a role, but they can play a much smaller role if we have innovation towards those ends, because the prices require that. Now, maybe everything becomes through things like this or through things like Ma'aden. We don't ever have to get there because the prices of minerals are so low with so much availability, or places around the world trying to step in to fill that void. But I also think it's not as dire. The other thing, my other favorite thing is one of the places there's rare earths in an automobile is in your motor that rolls up your window. So if we had a rare earth restriction, you might have to go like that again. Wouldn't that be awful?
We remember that.
Wouldn't that be awful if we all had to do that again? But anyways, yeah.
We're going to have to start wrapping this up, but talk to me. Actually, maybe I'll stay with you, Ian, to start our little wrap up and just come down. Again, what needs to be done now? We're looking at the outlook, and outlook's changed without a doubt. But what's the best case scenario out there in terms of what does this industry really need to do to move forward?
Well, I see a lot of the issues with permitting. What I think about is taking advantage of every asset we currently have as much as we can. So any sort of refining processing facility that's not separating out the minor metals or the critical minerals, that investment's cheap, the asset's already there, it's operating, it's essentially zero cost. Just do it. I don't know what's getting in the way, what governments have to do to subsidize that to make that happen.
Paul, looking ahead, where the big quick win-wins, because we have to get this right somehow.
Yeah. Look, I think we need to keep an eye and focus on continuing innovation. I think we've gotten better than we were. We fell into a real hole for sort of 30, 40 years in terms of innovation. I think we do need to continue investing in that. I think the big thing mining companies have to do is make sure we don't do anything that damages the brand of mining anymore. we need to talk it up. We need to make sure that people realise our way of life would not exist without mining, and the way of life we envision would not exist without mining. And the more we can get that message across and the more we can do to make sure we don't stuff that up, the better.
But the industry is not very good at doing that, is it?
No, the industry is not good at doing that jointly. There's some individuals that are good at doing it on their own, but collaboration has never been something we've been good at in industry, and we definitely need to learn how to do that and get our message across in a consistent and a more vocal manner.
And Joe, I mean, you know the power of communication and getting that message, out there. And I mean, whether we like it or not, I feel, having come from a media background, we look at the media at the moment, and it's hard to get them to do a good story. It just seems like if it's got to be anything to do with resources, it's a push to get a positive story out there right now. But looking to the near term, when you're back now with your team looking at outlooks, what's going to be top priority for you?
Well, just to build on what Paul said, I think collaboration in the industry is really important. But I go back to this. What I think is urgently needed is this producer-consumer dialogue.
Yeah.
To really, because if we don't do it, we're going to be looking at a slower energy transition. We're going to be looking at trade barriers and restrictions, and that's not going to help us meet our climate goals. It won't help, the critical minerals mining sector and the energy transition in general. So I think that's a very easy first step because a lot of that's not going. I think we could try to shut out the PR side of it because I don't think it's as urgently needed as getting the policymakers and the players, the industry players, on the same page.
Yeah, no, I mean, you're so right. And for a long time, that didn't exist in the hydrocarbon sector. Hence the creation of the International Energy Forum. But that dialogue was not there. It was, sort of two opposite sides. And sadly, that's beginning to happen, I think, a little bit in the mineral sector too. So we have to be careful. But all good thoughts. And, thank you for sharing your great ideas and experience and, your outlook on the outlook. So, gentlemen, thank you much. Ian, Paul, and to Joe, thank you so much.
Thanks
thank you,
much.
dear audience, for
Thank
being
you.
with us and staying with us for this.